Part 2, Writing in Translation. Some books do not simply appear in translation, but have been written for translation from the start. I call these books born translated because they are published almost simultaneously in multiple languages, and they engage formally, thematically, and sometimes typographically in the theory and practice of translation. Works of born translated fiction function as world literature in two important ways. As books, they travel beyond their place of origin, and as texts, they anticipate their own future within several literary geographies. I've argued elsewhere that the translation and global circulation of literary texts into more languages and faster than ever before has spurred new strategies of aesthetic production. Unlike the average international bestseller, works of born translated literature confront readers with the history and politics of language. This may seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense when we consider, as Venuti reminds us, that a good translation is supposed to pass for a work produced from the start in the target language. To do this, translators will often homogenize regional differences within national languages by simplifying vernacular idioms or exchanging vernacular phrases for standard formulations. For this reason, works that treat multilingualism through narrative events, characterization, and structure are more likely than those that treat multilingualism through idiom to retain in translation and engagement with local histories of language. Born translated fiction requires a new understanding both of how we read and of how much. Sometimes we are presented with multilingual narratives or groups of narratives in which we can analyze only some parts closely, because few of us will possess the necessary combination of languages, and because the quantity of languages one would need to know continues to grow as subsequent translations appear. These texts often direct our attention to narrative units that are larger than the word or the phrase. This can involve a kind of not reading, especially when we are asked to think about systems or institutions of literature. But more often we are asked to engage in a kind of new reading. Born translated works solicit what I call close reading at a distance. This practice differs from traditional close reading in two important ways. It demotes the analysis of idiom, the privileged object of close reading's attention, in favor of larger narrative units, and it adds circulation to the study of production by asking what constitutes the languages, boundaries, and media of the work. Pointing to the materiality of texts and to their appearance in the world as letters, diaries, memoirs, textbooks, guides, and ethnographies, David Mitchell's recent novels have asked us to consider how circulation feeds production and how histories of translation have shaped the futures of British literary history. His 2010 novel, The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, is both widely translated and substantially concerned with the history and politics of translation. Mitchell's novels offer useful alternatives to the familiar distinctions that have governed our discussions of the so-called global novel. In particular, our assumption that the novel today has two choices, the home and the world, local multiculture or global monoculture. Mitchell turns his attention to extreme forms of locality that depend on regional, transnational, and indeed global systems and impulses. He reminds us that the local is not one, and that it is often, geographically speaking, not very local. In The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, which will be my focus today, Mitchell places translation at the center of a story about political, economic, social, mythological, and scientific conceptions of inheritance. Most of the novel's pages are set in Dutch-controlled, Japanese-owned Dejima, a trading island off the coast of Nagasaki, circa 1799. Mitchell was born in England, and he was a resident of Japan for many years, and now lives in Ireland. From his biography, it can be hard to tell which audience he is seeking to address or claim for himself. Critics often accuse his fiction of ventriloquism, that is, of speaking in many voices, but in none that seem to be his own. The Thousand Autumns approaches the theme of ventriloquism directly because it focuses on commercial exchanges that are mediated by Japanese and Dutch interpreters, and indirectly because it presents its readers with a novel mediated by English. Jacob de Zoet is a Dutch clerk who learned Japanese over the course of 18 years and 479 paperback pages. Very little of the novel takes place in English at all. It is in this sense, among others, that the novel is born translated. The absence or near absence of English in the novel's diegesis allows Mitchell to emphasize all the better the status of English as the language of his fiction and as a language of the British Empire, whose future dominance is intimated but not described in the narrative. Unlike novels that use translation as a framing mechanism with fake prefaces or title pages, The Thousand Autumns presents translation as the condition of its narrative. I mean this in a few ways. First, the opening scene of the novel, an episode that will be crucial to the development of the plot, introduces us to Orido, a Japanese midwife who saves the magistrate's newborn child by using techniques she has learned from a Dutch translation of the Scottish treatise, William Smelly's Observations. For us, the scene takes place in English, but we are told throughout the episode that she is speaking both in Dutch and in Japanese, creating a code that includes the doctor but excludes the monolingual patient and her maid. Second, in the acknowledgments that constitute one of the novel's endings, Mitchell tells us that his research was guided by various translations of travelogues about late 18th century life in Japan, including Kempfer's Japan, an extraordinarily influential text composed in German, but first published and widely circulated in English in 1727. Kempfer's Japan, which also appears in the novel, became available in German only through the mediation of a French edition. In several ways, then, Bourne translated works not only shape Mitchell's novel, they are its precedent. Third, the novel suggests that the circulation and translation of books about obstetrics, political economy, maritime adventures, and botany, among many other topics, nourished both cosmopolitan and imperialist impulses, often at the same time and through the same book. One thinks here of Jacob's Dutch language edition of The Wealth of Nations, which his friend Ogawa, the Japanese interpreter, longs to translate as a contribution, he says, to the Japanese field of Dutch science. Ogawa is surprised to learn that Adam Smith wrote his book not in Dutch, but in English, and even more surprised that Smith, despite his language, can't be called an Englishman. The lesson here is complex, but we're meant to understand that what Ogawa values about Smith's book is not its models of self-interest and international trade, but the occasion he provides for learning Dutch and for creating transcultural conversations within Japan. The fourth way that translation functions as a condition of Mitchell's narrative is its sheer presence as a marker in the dialogue. In the 40 or so pages focalized through an English naval officer, we have to be told that one of the Dutch characters isn't speaking Dutch. By speaking in the language we are reading, he is speaking in a foreign tongue, and Mitchell goes out of his way to note this in the text. Finally, the novel incorporates translation not only at the level of plot, precedence, paratext, and conceit, but also at the level of form and structure. The most striking example is its use of two different calendars, the Gregorian and the lunar, to introduce the novel's 5 parts and each of the chapters within those parts. Sections in the novel whose dates are given in both calendars move between the focalization of Japanese and Dutch characters. Sections of the novel with lunar dates follow Japanese characters, and those with Gregorian dates, Dutch. Mitchell foreignizes the text, to use Venuti's term, not by altering or withdrawing fluency, so much as by pointing to languages diegetically, in Dutch, in Japanese, and so forth, and by reminding us that the novel's histories of Dutch mercantilism, imperial aspiration, and Enlightenment science all begin in translation. The Thousand Autumns asks us to focus not on idiom, but on structure. As Jacob tells Nagasaki's magistrate near the end of the narrative, speaking in the Japanese he has learned over the course of the novel, "The truth of a myth, Your Honor, is not its words, but its patterns." The novel is interested in history insofar as it asks us to learn about the translated origins of national and imperial legacies. But it is through myth, allegory, and approximation that it asks us to consider that philosophies of individualism, expressed as the belief in unique beginnings and distinctive futures, support regimes of slavery, violence, and exploitation that persist into the present.